Hello, I'm John Nichols, and for 42 years, I was an English GP or family doctor in a town called Guildford, which is quite near London. Now I'm no longer working. I keep quite busy writing, researching, and giving some occasional talks. And today I have a question for you, a question which people often ask me because I count myself a humanist. So they ask me, but what is a humanist? So let's try to answer that. It's not exactly straightforward, and it's not surprising that people find it a little mystifying. Well, there's a good dictionary definition, which will start us on the right track. Any system that puts human mind paramount, rejecting the supernatural. So everything can be explained naturally in terms of the human brain and the human mind, and reject the religious or supernatural explanations. Something else that humanists often say is we actually go back quite a long way, back to the Greek philosopher Protagoras, who would explain it by saying, man is the measure of all things. Forget about the gods, forget about all the religious superstition. Man is the measure of everything, which was controversial at the time and is controversial now. But Protagoras didn't call himself a humanist, though philosophers and historians often talk about the humanist philosophers of ancient Greece. Is cheating a bit because the term humanism is only 200 years old. In fact, it was first coined in 1808 by Friedrich Nietzsche, a Lutheran philosopher and educationist, who used the term humanism for the first time with the emphasis on self-belief and civic duty. So self-belief in yourself as a human being, I mean, you can see how that might morph over 100 years or so into a philosophy of humanism. Man is the measure of all things. So what does humanism mean to me as a doctor? Well, in the first place, it is the philosophy that helped me to cope with being a doctor, all the ups and downs of general practice, all the crises, personal and professional, but inevitable in a long life of general practice. Secondly, 50% of patients nowadays have no religious belief. They don't believe in God. They don't adhere to any particular religion. They might say they're atheists or agnostics. However, they may well not have any idea of humanism. They may certainly not call themselves a humanist. My guesstimate is that 10 to 20% of patients that a doctor sees may have humanist sympathies and even say that they would call themselves a humanist. We do have a problem, as I say, with this word humanism. It hasn't been around that long. In fact, there's a terminology dilemma, the sort of thing that philosophers spend a lot of time on, and there's a philosopher tearing his hair out over this sort of dilemma, which might explain why most philosophers seem to be bald. What about the humanities? Is it anything to do with that? Actually, no. The humanities are those subjects that one might study, the languages, history, geography, psychology even, that are not strictly speaking science. So the humanities are a red herring. What about humanitarian? Are humanists because they're humanitarian? Well, no, humanitarian and humanitarianism is relatively global. And most good Christians would say that they have a humanitarian outlook. To be liberal in your outlook, to be broad-minded towards others, love your neighbor, etc., to be fair to people, irrespective of race, color, or creed, is humanitarianism. So that is global, and it doesn't help us. Now, here's another word that you may not have heard of, which I'm going to start using. Humanistic. That means like humanism, like what we consider to be modern-day humanism, humanist-like or humanistic. So if I use that word, you'll know what I mean. So if I say that Protagoras was a humanistic philosopher, that would make sense. Two more words. Oh, this goes back to the dictionary definition. Two more words. Materialism is not the money-grubbing, self-centered outlook on life that you may find being denounced from the pulpit. Materialism, strictly speaking, in philosophical terms, means basing your philosophy of life on the rules of nature. Those aspects of nature that you can study, that you can see all around you, rather than going off at a tangent into the supernatural. Whereas dualism is the opposite. Dualism is a philosophy of life that is based on the idea that there's body and the soul is in another dimension of reality, which is separate from what we consider the natural world, and that this is in some ways more important than the natural world. So humanism would reject dualism, generally speaking. So humanistic is my buzzword. Three more things about modern humanists that I'd like to mention before we go any further. First of all, humanists are generally very enthusiastic Darwinists. Humanists, long before the word humanist came into general use, which is only about 100 years, it's been in general use to describe the philosophy that we now recognize, previously called themselves free thinkers. And somewhere in the 19th century, some free thinkers started calling themselves humanists. So free thinkers, it's a term that goes way back into the Middle Ages, the free thinkers. And humanists, generally, they reject the need for religion as a source of ethics and a morality in society, and believe that man has evolved to be naturally altruistic. It's an instinct which should be encouraged and certainly not discouraged. There's some tribalist attitudes discourage altruism beyond certain limits. Altruism, global altruism is the opposite of tribalism, I guess. Whereas many religions claim that you can't have a moral society without a religious belief. So humanists would reject that. Now let's have a brief look at the history of humanism, the ups and downs of the influence of humanistic philosophy, going from zero sometime in the distant past up to an influence approaching 60% today. That's a guesstimate, my guesstimates. So it starts in the first truck we have with humanism is philosophers in a Greek city-state called Miletus, more of that later. So that was a high point for humanistic philosophy. Athens, on the other hand, was not such a high point. Socrates, Plato, etc., were more dualists. They believed in the soul. The high point of Roman culture here, around about here, Rome existed for hundreds of years, and it doesn't look so long on this rather foreshortened graph, but for hundreds of years, Roman culture flourished, and three leading philosophers, Seneca, Cicero, and Lucretius, were relatively humanistic in their outlook, but especially Lucretius. Then you get the fall of Rome and the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, and things didn't really upturn significantly to be any better than ancient Rome until the Enlightenment. And you may say, what about Islam, the civilizing effect of Islam and the Renaissance? Well, they both certainly shook things up, but as we'll see, they didn't make the big difference that you might expect. So let's talk more about Miletus. Here it is, one of a cluster of Greek city-states in what is modern-day Turkey, and Troy would have been a bit of a wreck by then after the sack of Troy. And the Persian and Mede Empire came up to this red line, which is another story because eventually the Greeks were pushed out. But in the meantime, 2,600 years ago, the philosophers of Miletus were laying down the foundations of humanistic philosophy. And it was a lovely liberal regimen, this Greek city-state, which encouraged philosophers and free thinkers, and they had lots of helpful original ideas about agriculture and invention of machinery. They're inventors as well, and interpretation of the natural world. Anaximander was the first one, maybe this old chap, then Thales, Hecataeus, and when they had all come and gone and died off, the last one was Leucippus. And the Miletus school of philosophy rejected mythical religious explanations for origins and established a system of discourse, observation, and challenging and rebuilding theories. Now, just think about that statement and consider, is there something familiar about this? A system of observation, challenging and rebuilding theories. This sounds very much like the basis of modern science, but this was 2,600 years ago, which is quite remarkable. So going back to Miletus and this lovely liberal regimen rather abruptly came to an end with a change of regimen in the time of Leucippus, and he had to get on a boat before he got in trouble with the new regimen, the new leaders, and off he went to Abdera, which is in the far north of the Greek coast, northeast coast of Greece, which was again a relatively liberal regimen, more suitable for this particular Greek philosopher. And there he took on as a student Democritus. Now, Democritus might be the first name that you find familiar because he was a big influence in the ancient world. And Leucippus and Democritus taught the following. The world is round, it's not flat. The world is round and floats in boundless space, and there are other worlds, based on their observations. All matter is made of elementary grains of reality that they called atoms. But what about the great variety of substances that you see in nature? The infinite variety of substances derives from combinations of these basic atoms, what nowadays we call molecules, but they didn't have that word then. And the soul, they said, is made of fire atoms and disintegrates with death. So there's probably no afterlife, they reckoned. So this was a materialist philosophy based on their observations of nature and ruling out what they would consider superstitious ideas about the soul and the gods, etc. Then, jumping forward a little bit, we see Jesus arriving on the scene. A rather refreshing view of life that he gives. It's a bit distorted by different interpretations, but you get a flavor of the man. And I am asking the question, was he humanistic? Was he anything like a humanistic philosopher? Well, maybe a little bit, because he said you should guard against hypocrisy. And he told the parable of the Good Samaritan, which illustrates hypocrisy and the opposite. The Good Samaritan was not a Jew. And this and other comments were anti-tribalist, which is, to me, typical of a humanistic philosophy. He also preached forgiveness, and this you see in the parable of the prodigal son. And he said, love your enemies, do good to those that hate you, which was a pretty revolutionary way of seeing things at the time. He also said, blessed are they who, or purported to have said, blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He talked about the afterlife quite a lot, which is not, I'm afraid, humanistic. One of the strange things to me, other people don't find it strange, but I do, is that there are no surviving writings. We know that this was a literate man. In the Bible, there are accounts of him both reading and writing. And his contemporaries, Peter, Paul, John, James, they all leave written records. But their leader, Jesus, are we supposed to believe he never wrote out anything down? He never wrote letters to his mum? Well, I don't know. It seems strange to me. So let's again get this bird's eye view of the ancient world and what happened to philosophers, because there was a great divide marked by Plato in Athens and his philosophy based on dualism and belief in the soul. So that the philosophers talk about the pre-Socratic and post-Socratic, because Socrates, of course, was Plato's teacher. So the pre-Socratic philosophers obviously include people like Anaximander, Protagoras, and of course Democritus. And the post-Socratic, Plato, Aristotle, and many other philosophers that came afterwards. Not all of them were dualists. Not all of them believed in the soul. There were some fairly skeptical ones. Interestingly, in AD 390, a Christian Roman emperor, Theodosius I, sent out an edict to destroy all pre-Christian text, except for Plato and Aristotle. His big campaign was to stamp out paganism, and that included Democritus. And there were very many writings from Democritus. He was very fertile in his writing, and yet it all went on the bonfire. Here he is, and the man himself, Theodosius I, and he's responsible for the destruction of all the wonderful books that Democritus wrote at the height of his powers, because he thought he was stamping out paganism. But a lot of the ideas from Meletus, particularly Democritus, did survive via this route, via Seneca, Cicero, and Lucretius, whose works didn't go on the bonfire because they were good Romans, you see, and they had read and taken on board the works of Democritus, particularly Lucretius, and they were filed away in libraries, particularly in parts of Italy, in monasteries and things, and forgotten for hundreds of years. And then they were rediscovered at the time of the Renaissance, and they helped to fuel the Renaissance. As I say, things were shook up quite a lot. There were some very different ideas came in, but you still had to wait a little while because it wasn't until the Enlightenment that was a real change in philosophical attitudes. Now, I mentioned freethinkers being a label that was commonly applied well before humanism came onto the scene. So humanistic freethinkers hold that you should not be formed on the basis, your views should be based on logic, reason, and empiricism rather than tradition and dogma. So that is humanistic. Medieval freethinkers were rejected and punished as heretics, and many of them were burned at the stake, I'm afraid. In 1600, and this is well into the Renaissance, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in the center of Rome for his heretical ideas, including that the sun was the center of the solar system and the earth goes around the sun. He had some fairly heretical ideas about the Virgin Mary and other icons of Christianity, which didn't stand him in good stead too. Here he is, a bit of a firebrand, bit of a maverick. He went around Italy lecturing these rather revolutionary ideas of his, and was finally, they had enough of him, and he was asked to either recant or be burnt at the stake, and he refused to recant. Then 33 years later, Galileo, the great Roman scientist, was threatened with the same fate, and he quite sensibly, I think, agreed to recant rather than be burnt at the stake. But he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. I'm going to jump forward just 100 years now to David Hume in Scotland. So no chance of him being burnt at the stake up in Scotland, well away from the religious zealots of Rome. He was a philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment era, and he attacked naive superstition and religious belief, and he never got the university post that his talents deserved. His friends were always concerned that he didn't get his just deserts. And also they persuaded him to delay a book he'd been working on for a long time called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which was certainly be considered heretical in some quarters. So he was persuaded by his friends to delay it so that it was published after his death. And he tells a story against himself, which I find rather charming. As you can see, he's a rather portly gent, but he loved to go on his country walks. And one day, cutting across a boggy area, he got totally stuck in the bog, just out of reach of a good solid bank. He couldn't quite reach it. And he shouted out, "Help, anybody there?" And eventually this woman came and saw him, was about to pull him out, when she said, "Just a minute, you're that horrible atheist, David Hume, aren't you?" And he said, "Well, madam, I am David Hume, but I am not an atheist." And she said, "Really? Oh, I'm not sure I believe you. Well, I'll think about pulling you out if you recite the Lord's Prayer." So he gave a perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer, and she still wasn't entirely happy. So she asked for an encore, which he did. And then he says, she finally agreed to pull me out of the bog. She must have been a strong lady. When he was dying, James Boswell, who is best known for his biography of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who compiled the first English dictionary, who was a friend, but a Christian, asked whether wasn't he worried about what would happen to him after death? He replied that he had no more concern for this than he had for the times before he was born, but he never admitted to being an atheist. Jumping forward another 100 years, and we're leaving out a lot of interesting people, but I want to be brief, to the great hero of modern humanism, Charles Darwin. And his theory of evolution by natural selection explained a lot of mysteries, explained a lot about fossils and vestigial organs and all sorts of things that hadn't been adequately explained before. But he said it is no magic formula. There's nothing magic about natural selection because natural selection produces results that are just good enough for reproduction and survival. That help you to survive and live long enough and healthy enough to reproduce. And that is the ultimate yardstick of all natural selection. And he went on to explain, natural selection will not produce absolute perfection, nor do we always meet, so far as we can judge, with this high standard under nature. I think that's an important point to remember when understanding arguments for and against evolution, because creationists, those against the theory of evolution, say, how can this perfect organism or organ like the eye be a result of this random process? No, the eye is not perfect. It has several anatomical imperfections. It's just good enough. And that's how natural selection works. He also said regarding religion that he did not reject outright the existence of God, but he explained, I quote, "The whole subject is too profound for human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton." Also, one of his best friends, Professor Thomas Henry Huxley, who is described in the press as Darwin's bulldog, the way he defended Darwin, his friend Darwin, and Darwinism. Huxley coined the term agnosticism. If you're an agnostic, that is what I would call a logical alternative to atheism, because an atheist says, that's it, I've decided there is no God. But if you challenge him, are you sure? Can you prove it? No, you can't. So the only really logical situation is to say, as Huxley did, agnostic, not knowing whether there is a God or not. And Darwin pretty much went along with that. So I think if challenged, Darwin would have said he was an agnostic. So Thomas Henry Huxley's grandson, another hero of mine, is Julian Huxley, who was a distinguished scientist in his own right. And he went on to be a leading figure in the early days of the British Humanist Association and the United Nations as well. In his book, Essays of a Humanist, he said, I quote, "It is easier to destroy than construct, easier to smash a cathedral, a city, or a statue than to create one." He went on to say, with respect to religion, he was trying not to be negative about religion, but nevertheless, he went on to say, "I believe that a drastic reorganization of our pattern of religion and religious thought is now becoming necessary from a God-centered to an evolutionary-centered pattern." And that was quite a controversial idea at the time. It was controversial to religious folk who thought it was a bit of a blasphemy. And it was controversial to the hard-nosed atheists who didn't see any need for a religion of any sort. But what was he driving at? I think I would call the philosophy or religion that he's suggesting evolutionary humanism. And he had plenty of wise thoughts, suggestions, ideas to build a philosophy of evolutionary humanism, as we shall see. He also said, and this is one of the cornerstones of his philosophy and my own, he said, by speech first, but far more by writing, man has been able to put something of himself beyond death. In tradition and in books, an integral part of the individual persists, where it can influence the minds and actions of other people. In different places and at different times, a row of black marks on a page can move a man to tears, though the bones of him that wrote it are long ago crumbled to dust. In truth, the whole progress of civilization is based upon this power. I found that quite profound. He also had an interesting dialogue with a Jesuit scientist called Teilhard de Chardin. Now, Teilhard de Chardin was a philosopher and anthropologist, as well as a priest. He discovered the remains of Homo erectus, nicknamed Peking Man, during his time in China, for instance. And he wrote a lot of philosophical treatises. I think to a large extent, he was trying to bridge the gap between religion and scientists. He had a foot in both camps. So to begin with, let's hear from Julian Huxley. He said, in the psychosocial phase of evolution, the same three processes operating in biological evolution are still at work. Cladogenesis, branching out a family tree into new species, new forms, new ideas in psychosocial phase. Anagenesis, regeneration, producing new ideas and innovations, like a totally new species in biological terms, but a breakthrough, a brainwave, a new idea. And lastly, stasigenesis, preservation of old ideas and superstitions, and not to underrate the importance of the old ideas. Some of the old ideas that have stood the test of time are well worth retaining. So that was his view of the psychosocial phase of evolution as it transcends biological evolution. And here is Teilhard de Chardin's view, which is quite mind-blowing in a way when you study it. He says, matter obeyed from the beginning that great law of biology, the law of complexification. The thinking layer, or noosphere, develops and entwines its fibers, not to confuse and neutralize them, but to reinforce them in the living unity of a single tissue. So he's talking about the psychosocial phase of evolution, but he's saying it's like a new layer around the world, which he calls the noosphere. And he was saying this in 1950, and yet what he's describing sounds suspiciously like the internet, doesn't it? So let's go further into this idea of Teilhard de Chardin, this layer of the Earth being a series of spheres culminating in the noosphere. So to begin with, you have this great lump of molten rock settling into a sphere with a bit of a crust developing on the outside. That's the lithosphere. Then, as the crust stabilizes, you get chemical changes. You get the formation of the chemosphere. Now, we don't know much about the chemosphere. It didn't leave fossilized remains. We can deduce from our knowledge of chemistry that the chemical processes in this layer became more and more complex, and even maybe different chemical pathways competed with each other, mimicking life in a way, but before life. So this is a pre-biological, pre-life chemosphere. And obviously the next stage after that is the biosphere, living things evolving from this chemosphere. You see first plants and then animals evolving, and finally humans like us. So you've got the three layers now, the lithosphere, the chemosphere, and the biosphere. Then finally, according to Teilhard de Chardin, you get the noosphere, the sphere of the mind, the sphere of ideas, the sphere of technology, the sphere of religion, and all sorts of ideas. And here you see some key players like the Rosetta Stone, typewriters evolving into computers and evolving, amongst other things, into CAT scanners, internal combustion engine evolving into the jet aeroplane, evolving into rocket ships, and books play a key role in passing on these ideas. So this network, which we now know is greatly aided by the internet. And here is an example of just what's happened in the 20th century as a result of evolving ideas leading to changes in artifacts in the technological realm. I don't think the clocks are very impressive. They haven't evolved very much, whereas telephones have evolved enormously. But the real evolution happens in here in the brain, and this is just the outcome. Likewise, sound reproduction. Now, another way of looking at it is Richard Dawkins's idea of the meme, the unit of thought, the basic unit of thought, which he describes it as behaving in the noosphere in the same way as the gene behaves in the biosphere. The gene is the driving force in evolution and natural selection, and the gene behaves as though it's motivated for survival. It's just behaving towards in accordance with the laws of natural selection, but it's behaving in a rather interesting way if you think of it as he did, as the selfish gene. And he's saying the meme is the same. It is a similar unit of evolution in the noosphere, and it has a similar drive to spread and survive, to reproduce, spread and survive. And to do that, it makes use of replicators, like the Rosetta Stone, like books, but there is no live gene. A replicator is a way of passing the plan of a meme from one brain to another, but real live memes only exist in here, in the brain. Incidentally, one of the important roles of Julian Huxley in the science of the 20th century was to put together Darwin's ideas and the growing science of genetics, to make them into one science. He wrote a seminal book about combining these two. And in many ways, Richard Dawkins has followed on here, taking things a step further. So it looks as though at the end of the day, Protagoras has been justified. Man is the measure of all things. We control this world. Its fate hangs in the balance depending upon whether we make a good job of it or not. And yet, is man ultimately the measure of all things? Maybe not if we get a visitation from aliens from outer space. That could change things radically. Now, evolutionary humanism, Teilhard de Chardin, Julian Huxley, they don't have it all their own way, because here we have a critique from one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, Sir Peter Medawar, who died in 1987. And his view of it was rather different from mine. He said of Teilhard de Chardin's writings, the greater part of it is nonsense, tricked out with a variety of tedious metaphysical conceits, and its author can be excused of dishonesty only on the grounds that before deceiving others, he has taken great pains to deceive himself. It is the style that creates the illusion of content. Oh dear, that's not very nice, is it? Well, he was an atheist, and that is very much the opinion of many atheists in the humanist camp nowadays. So it is not my opinion, but it is a widespread attitude. Now I'm going to summarize my view of humanism now. First of all, the pre-Socratic philosophers were mainly humanists by our modern standards, humanistic philosophy. The Emperor Theodosius I and the early church destroyed humanistic literature, and it stayed buried until the Renaissance. Free thinkers and Christian humanists gained ground in the 19th century. Secular humanism emerged in the 20th century and continues to grow in popularity. Evolutionary humanism is currently rather out of favor in the humanist movement, but I think its time is going to come. Watch this space. I think it'll soon come back into vogue. We'll see. If you want to know more about my views on science, medicine, and religion, check my website here. And will see there excerpts from my books on nutrition science, nutritional medicine, and my science fiction. So that's all from me for now. Thank you for listening. And I'll say goodbye.